Hey everyone, and welcome back for another Coffeesodes deep dive.
Deep dive.
We're brewing up episode 14 today.
14 already.
I know, right? And you know that all the fascinating research we're dissecting is linked in the episode description so you can follow along. This time we're taking a deep dive into the world of trust, specifically how we make decisions about trusting others.
Big topic.
And not just based on gut feelings. We're going to break down a research paper that uses a classic economic experiment
Cool.
called the investment game.
Classic.
And then throw some computational modeling in the mix to really get into the nitty-gritty.
Sounds complicated.
Yeah, it kind of is, but that's why we're here to break it down.
And that's what we do.
So it's really interesting how the researchers went beyond simply describing trust.
Yeah.
They actually built a computational model to simulate how it works.
It's really cool.
This allows us to play around with different scenarios and see how various factors influence those decisions about trust you were talking about.
Exactly. It's like a trust simulator.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, let's start with the basics.
Okay.
Can you explain the investment game for those who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. Go for it.
So the investment game, or IG for short, is all about understanding how people behave when they have to decide whether to trust someone else with their money.
Right.
There are two players, the investor and the trustee.
Makes sense.
Imagine you're the investor and you're given, say, $10.
$10.
You have to decide how much of that money you want to give to the trustee.
Ooh, decisions.
I'm already feeling a bit anxious about this.
Oh, yeah.
What happens next?
All right, so here's the catch.
Oh, yeah.
Any money you give to the trustee is tripled. But then the trustee gets to decide how much of that tripled amount they want to give back to you.
Okay.
The thing is,
Yeah.
there are no guarantees.
So as the investor, you have to weigh the potential gains against the risk of potentially getting nothing back. The more you invest, the higher the potential reward, but also the greater the potential for loss.
It's kind of like that moment when you decide to lend money to a friend.
Oh, yeah.
Do you go all in or hold back a little just in case?
Exactly. The investment game essentially boils us down into a simplified social setting where we can study trust and reciprocity.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So how does this new research paper fit into all of this?
Well, one of the things they really dig into is the concept of trustworthiness.
Okay.
They point out that three main characteristics make someone seem trustworthy:
Okay.
ability, benevolence, and integrity.
So to break that down, ability means I'm more likely to trust someone who knows what they're doing. Benevolence means I believe they actually care about my well-being. And integrity means they're honest and consistent with a strong moral compass.
You nailed it. The paper highlights how the investment game has been really useful for studying benevolence and integrity, but doesn't quite capture the ability aspect as easily.
Interesting.
They actually had to modify the game a bit to factor that in, which we can talk about later.
I'm curious to hear more about that modification.
We'll get there.
But before we get there, can we talk a little bit about the existing models of trust?
Sure.
You mentioned that this paper proposes a new model, right?
Yes. So it's called the vulnerability model.
Okay.
But before we dive into that, it's helpful to understand one of the models that's often been used to explain behavior in the investment game,
Got it.
the inequity aversion model.
Okay, so what's the idea behind the inequity aversion model?
Basically, this model suggests that people don't like unequal outcomes,
Okay,
especially when they're the ones on the losing end.
makes sense.
While it can explain some behavior in the IG,
Okay.
it doesn't quite capture the whole picture of trust.
How so?
Think about it.
Okay.
In the investment game, it's not just about the final outcome.
Right.
It's about the choices the trustee makes. Do they choose to share back with you, even if it means they get a little less?
Yeah.
That intentionality, that willingness to prioritize fairness goes beyond simply avoiding inequality.
So it's not just about the money,
It's not just about the money.
but about the message behind the money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about the actions and what they reveal about the other person.
Interesting.
This is where the vulnerability model comes in.
Okay, I'm all ears.
All right.
Tell me about this vulnerability model.
This model looks at trust as a trade-off. You're weighing a potential loss, your investment,
Right.
against a potential gain, the return you might get from the trustee. What's really neat about this model is that it lines up beautifully with how psychologists actually define trust. It captures that element of vulnerability.
Right.
When you trust someone, you're making yourself vulnerable to them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But how can we actually measure this vulnerability?
Well, the model introduces something called the trust parameter.
The trust parameter.
You can think of it as a score from 0 to 1.
Right.
That represents an individual's general tendency to trust others.
Okay.
A higher score means you're more willing to be vulnerable, more likely to take that leap of faith.
So someone with a score close to 1 is like the ultimate trusting soul,
Yeah, they're very trusting.
while someone with a score closer to 0 is probably carrying some trust issues.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
And this trust parameter can be used to simulate all sorts of scenarios in the investment game, which helps us understand how people with different propensities to trust might behave.
Okay, let's get into those simulations.
Let's do it.
I'm really curious to see how this plays out.
All right, so
Yeah.
let's imagine a scenario where the trustee initially cooperates and returns a fair share to the investor, but then all of a sudden they decide to betray that trust and keep most of the money for themselves.
Wow. That's cold.
The model shows how differently trustful and distrustful people react to this betrayal.
I'm guessing those with lower trust scores are probably like, see? I knew it.
Yeah.
And slam the brakes on any future investments.
Right. They're much quicker to reduce their investments, showing a classic once bitten, twice shy response.
But those with higher trust scores, while obviously disappointed, are a bit more forgiving.
They are.
At least initially.
Yes, at first.
They might need more evidence of untrustworthy behavior
Yeah.
before they really pull back.
It sounds like the more trusting folks are giving the trustee a second chance, hoping they'll redeem themselves.
And this gets to another really interesting aspect of the model.
Yeah.
It doesn't just simulate breaches of trust.
No, it doesn't.
It also looks at how trust can be repaired.
Exactly.
So there's hope for redemption after all.
There is.
Tell me more about that.
Imagine the trustee realizes they messed up
Okay.
and tries to make amends by being more cooperative in subsequent rounds.
Right.
The model shows that trustful individuals are generally quicker to forgive and start increasing their investments again.
Okay.
But distrustful people, they're going to need a lot more convincing before they're willing to risk getting burned again.
That makes me think about how some people need a lot more proof before they're willing to trust again.
Right.
It's like they have a really high bar for regaining trust.
Exactly. And it's actually pretty realistic when you think about real-life relationships.
It is.
Once trust is broken, it can be really hard to rebuild, but it's not impossible.
That's a good life lesson right there.
It is.
Okay, this is all incredibly fascinating.
It is really cool stuff.
But we haven't even touched on the role of expectations or the impact of loss aversion, right?
We haven't, but those are key components of the vulnerability model.
Okay.
And they really help us understand those nuances of trust you were just mentioning.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here.
All right.
Tell me everything.
Let's start with expectations.
Okay.
Think about it this way.
Okay.
If you go into the investment game expecting the trustee to be fair,
Right.
even if they make a small mistake, you might not be too bothered.
Yeah.
You're giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
But if you go in with negative expectations from the start, even a tiny act of selfishness could completely shatter your trust.
It sounds like our pre-existing beliefs about people can really influence how we interpret their actions.
They absolutely do. And this has big implications for understanding trust.
Yeah.
Especially in situations where those expectations might be skewed, like in clinical populations.
Wow, that's incredibly insightful. Okay, so what about loss aversion?
Loss aversion.
How does that factor into the equation?
Loss aversion is basically the idea that the pain of a loss feels way stronger than the pleasure of an equal gain.
Right, like losing $10 feels way worse than finding $10 feels good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's clever about the vulnerability model is that it incorporates this very real human tendency into its calculations.
Interesting.
And what the researchers found is that this fear of loss can make it even harder to repair trust,
Okay.
especially for those who are already distrustful.
It makes sense that if you're already wary of trusting someone, the added fear of losing something would just amplify that hesitation, right?
Precisely, it becomes this double whammy of doubt and fear.
This is so interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool.
But I'm still curious about how they dealt with the ability component of trustworthiness in their model.
Right.
We were talking earlier about how the classic investment game doesn't really allow you to measure that.
It doesn't, so they had to get a bit creative.
Okay, how did they do that?
To incorporate the ability aspect,
Yeah.
they introduced a modified version of the investment game.
Okay.
In this version, the multiplier, remember that's the amount the trustee's money is multiplied by,
Right, right.
is actually linked to how well the trustee performs on a separate task.
So they added a skill component to the game.
Exactly. The better the trustee performs on this separate task,
Right.
the higher the multiplier becomes in the investment game.
Interesting.
This task performance is meant to represent the trustee's competence.
Okay.
So now the investor has to consider not just the trustee's benevolence or good intentions, but also their competence, their ability to actually deliver.
Wow, that definitely adds a whole other layer of complexity to the game.
It does.
I bet this modified version allows the model to make some really interesting predictions about trust behavior, right?
It absolutely does.
Okay.
We can now explore how different combinations of competence and benevolence influence trust decisions.
Okay.
For example, what happens when you have a trustee who's super competent, really good at what they do, but not very benevolent? Meaning they might be a bit selfish.
Ooh, that's a tough one. It's like, do you trust someone who's capable but maybe a little untrustworthy?
Right.
Yeah.
And the model actually predicts that investors are still more likely to invest in a trustee who's competent but potentially selfish compared to someone who is both incompetent and malevolent.
Because at least with a competent, even if slightly selfish trustee, there's a chance of some return.
Exactly. It highlights the power of competence, even when there are concerns about benevolence.
Interesting.
Now, on the flip side, what about a trustee who's really well-intentioned, has a heart of gold, but just isn't very competent?
The well-meaning, but maybe slightly bumbling type.
Yes. In these cases, the model predicts lower investment levels compared to someone who is both benevolent and competent. However, investors are still more likely to trust them than someone who's malevolent, regardless of competence.
People are willing to take a chance on good intentions, even if there's a risk of things not going perfectly according to plan.
Precisely. What's fascinating
Yeah.
is how the model is able to capture this intricate interplay of factors and make such nuanced predictions about how people approach trust. It really highlights the complexity of human social behavior.
It makes you think about all the mental gymnastics we probably do subconsciously when we're trying to decide who to trust in real life.
It really does.
And we've only just scratched the surface of what this vulnerability model can do.
We have.
There's still so much more to unpack, like the limitations of the model and the broader implications of all these findings.
So much to discuss.
This is turning out to be one of our most thought-provoking coffeesodes yet.
It is.
Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a quick sip of our coffee blood.
Mine's getting cold.
Mine too. And then come back to explore those limitations and see what it all means in the bigger picture.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the investment game and trust parameters to the influence of expectations and loss aversion.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that even this super insightful vulnerability model has its limitations.
It does.
Can we dive into that a bit?
Absolutely. No model is perfect, right?
True.
And even this sophisticated model has a few caveats. For one thing, it assumes a fairly simple way of averaging past behavior when it comes to calculating trust. But in real life, our judgments about trustworthiness are probably more nuanced than that.
You mean we probably consider things like how big the betrayal was?
Exactly.
Or how long ago it happened?
Exactly. It's not just a simple average.
Makes sense.
Another limitation is that the model mainly focuses on the investor's perspective. It doesn't really delve into what's going on in the trustee's mind.
So we're only seeing one side of the trust coin.
Right.
Interesting.
We're getting this incredible glimpse into how people decide who to trust.
Yeah.
But we need more research to understand the other side of the equation, how people decide whether or not to honor that trust.
That's true. We haven't talked about that.
Yeah. And lastly, the model doesn't really account for the impact of cumulative earnings.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it.
Okay.
How much money you already have could affect how sensitive you are to potential losses.
That makes sense.
A millionaire might be more willing to invest a large sum than someone who's struggling to make ends meet.
Even with those limitations, this whole model is super impressive.
It is.
It really shines a light on how vulnerability, expectations, and even our fear of loss all play a role when we're deciding who to trust.
It is a powerful tool for understanding this fundamental aspect of human behavior, isn't it?
It totally is. But let's zoom out for a second
Okay.
and think about why all of this matters.
Okay.
What are the real-world implications of understanding how trust works?
The implications are massive. Trust is the bedrock of so many things in our lives.
Yeah,
Our relationships, our economies, even our political systems.
that's true.
Would you invest in a company you didn't trust?
No way.
Or vote for a leader you thought was dishonest?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. Without trust, cooperation falls apart, and societies can really struggle.
Okay, that got serious for a minute.
It's true, though.
But you're right, trust is crucial.
It is.
So how can we use this research
Yeah.
to build more trust in the world? I mean, can we actually do something with these insights?
Well, first and foremost, it highlights how important it is to be trustworthy ourselves.
Oh, okay.
Being reliable, demonstrating competence, and acting with integrity are all things that build a reputation and make people more likely to trust us.
So it's all about leading by example, walking the walk.
Exactly. But it also emphasizes the importance of managing expectations. If we go into situations with overly positive or unrealistically negative expectations, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and distrust.
Being realistic about people and acknowledging that everyone makes mistakes sometimes.
Right. And finally, I think this research encourages us to be more aware of the impact of loss aversion. Sometimes that fear of losing something can paralyze us and prevent us from taking risks, even when those risks could lead to positive outcomes.
It's that classic risk versus reward dilemma.
It is.
But when it comes to trust,
Yeah.
that risk often involves putting our hearts on the line.
Absolutely. Understanding these dynamics helps us navigate those complicated social situations with more awareness and make smarter decisions about who we choose to trust.
This is making me think about my own experiences with trust, both good and bad, and how my expectations and even my own aversion to loss have shaped my reactions in those situations. It's like I'm seeing things through a new lens. This has been a truly mind-blowing conversation.
It has.
But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Remember how the researchers had to modify the investment game?
Yes.
To include the ability component?
They did.
It made me realize that in real life, we rarely get such clear-cut information about someone's trustworthiness.
That's a great point. We often have to make decisions based on incomplete or even ambiguous information.
Exactly. It made me wonder, how do you think people assess trustworthiness when they don't have all the facts?
That is such a fascinating question.
Yeah.
I think we all have these little trust heuristics.
Those tourists.
These unconscious rules of thumb that we've developed over time based on our experiences and what we've learned from others.
Like little internal trust detectors.
Yes.
Maybe things like how someone carries themselves or the way they talk about other people.
Right. Or even just a gut feeling we get. It's this fascinating mix of intuition and learned experience.
I feel like we could do a whole other deep dive just on those trust heuristics.
We totally could. There's so much to explore there.
Okay, I'm adding that to our list of future episode ideas. But for today, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
What really stands out to you from all of this?
For me, the biggest takeaway is this. Trust is much more than just a feeling.
Okay.
It's a complex process shaped by our experiences, expectations, our personalities, and even our evolutionary history. It's something we constantly negotiate and renegotiate in every interaction we have.
I love that. It really underscores how dynamic and multifaceted trust is.
It is.
We're not just born trusting or distrusting. It's something we're constantly calibrating and refining.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
This episode has been incredible. But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder.
All right.
Think about a time when you had to make a decision about trusting someone.
Okay.
Maybe without having all the information you would have liked.
Right.
What were those internal cues, those little flags or green lights that guided your decision?
Yeah.
It's amazing how much goes into those seemingly simple judgments about who to trust.
That's a great point to leave everyone with.
Yeah.
We often make these decisions without even realizing all the factors that are influencing us.
It really makes you wonder how much of our ability to trust is something we're born with and how much is shaped by our experiences.
Nature versus nurture.
Like, do we come into the world with a certain level of trust, or is it all about what we learn from our interactions with others?
That's a question researchers are still trying to figure out. There's evidence pointing to both nature and nurture playing a role.
Okay.
Some studies suggest that there might be a genetic component to our tendency to trust,
Interesting.
while others emphasize the impact of early childhood experiences on shaping our trust patterns.
So it's probably a combination of both, right?
Probably.
Like we might have a certain predisposition to be more or less trusting,
Yeah.
but then our life experiences really fine-tune those tendencies.
Exactly. It's that incredible dance between our genes and our environment
Yeah.
that makes each of us unique.
Right.
But what's really exciting is that even if we might be predisposed to be more cautious or more open when it comes to trusting others,
Right.
we're not stuck with those tendencies.
So there's hope for those of us who might lean towards being a bit distrustful.
Absolutely. Our brains are amazingly adaptable.
That's good.
We can learn to be more trusting, even if it takes some conscious effort and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's like building a muscle. The more we practice trusting, the stronger that trust muscle becomes.
I love that analogy.
Thanks.
And it works both ways. If we constantly surround ourselves with people who betray our trust, that trust muscle can weaken over time.
This is making me rethink my entire social circle. But in all seriousness, this conversation has been incredibly eye-opening.
It really has been a great discussion.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how trust works.
Yeah.
And I can already see how these insights can help me navigate relationships in a more thoughtful way.
I'm so glad to hear that. And that's really the point of these deep dives, isn't it? To give you new tools and perspectives that you can apply to your own life.
It definitely has. And I know our listeners are out there feeling just as inspired as I am.
I hope so.
I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of trust. A huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise and helping us unravel this complex topic.
The pleasure was all mine.
I always enjoy these conversations.
Me too.
And to all of our wonderful Coffeesodes listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery.
Thanks, everyone.
We hope you found this episode as thought-provoking and insightful as we did.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep those trust muscles flexed.
And keep brewing those delicious conversations.
We'll see you in the next episode of Coffeesodes.